just start by introducing yourself for everybody?
Sure, I'm Michelle Alexander. I'm a law professor at Ohio State University.
Okay, well, could you tell us how you became interested in researching the mass incarceration of black males, particularly, and then just in general?
Well, my passion for this was born of my work at the ACLU directing the Racial Justice Project. I was working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality, and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and really trying to assist people when they've been released from prison re-enter as they faced one legal barrier to finding work and housing and just survival. And it was in those years that I had what I now call my awakening. I basically became awake to the reality that our criminal justice system functions more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. And I decided I wanted to dedicate the rest of my life to ensuring that the caste-like system that's been created in the United States is dismantled, and that we no longer have a second-class status for poor people, particularly poor folks of color in the United States who've been criminalized at young ages and then permanently locked up or locked out of mainstream society, not worthy of ever voting again or ever having the same opportunities. To me, it's just eerily reminiscent of the Jim Crow days. It's a similar mindset.
And how do you see that mindset sort of trickling down into the school system, like the public school system?
Yeah, well, it does in subtle ways and not so subtle ways. When I look at kind of zero tolerance policies that have been embraced in school districts around the country, the language, the zero tolerance language, actually came from the DEA. The Drug Enforcement Agency was the first to use the term zero tolerance, and it was part of the drug war rhetoric of having zero tolerance for drugs. And that rhetoric of zero tolerance was born in a war, a drug war aimed at poor folks of color, and then it shows up in these school discipline manuals and becomes kind of the standard lingo for school discipline, and it all is traceable to this war-like mentality of there's some folks who are disposable, that we have no tolerance for. There's no second chances, no third chances. And, it's not, of course, the privileged kids who are being subjected to these kind of zero tolerance policies and attitudes. It's, the kids who are poorest, most vulnerable, who are struggling, who are told, no second chances for you, you're out of here. And this idea that some people are just disposable, you can just get rid of them, kicking them out of school, locking them up. I think that mentality that some people just aren't worth anything, aren't worth our care and concern, that mentality is what lies at the root of our system of mass incarceration. And you see it in our schools, in discipline policies, and also in this subtle, belief, I think, that still persists, particularly in ghettoized school, that some kids aren't going to amount to anything and can't be taught and are nothing but trouble. And, that mentality not only becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but it ensures that, just extraordinary numbers of kids never get a shot.
So how do you see your book being useful for people of all ages in order to bring that consciousness and awareness that we spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I'm really excited about how the book's being used as a tool in schools, both at kind of the college and university level, but also in high schools. And many faith groups have been using it as well. There are a number of study guides that have been created for the book. One that's explicitly kind of a faith-based study guide from an African American perspective, but other study guides put out by Unitarians, put out by other groups. And I think study circles are a really kind of powerful way of kind of beginning a conversation about the system of mass incarceration, what people can do individually and collectively in response. So study groups, study circles, holding forums, and kind of using it as a tool by folks who want to begin a conversation and have something that people can read together and discuss and debate and kind of figure out what else do we need to know. There are lots of wonderful books and films and resources out there today, and I think forming a study circle is a really excellent way to get started. There are a number of study circles that have become organizing vehicles in New York, in Denver, and California, and elsewhere, where people have started off as a study group and now are building coalitions regionally and, like in New York, even statewide now, that stemmed from small groups of people just getting together and deciding, after really delving deeply into these issues, that they wanted to be part of a movement for change. And so I hope it will continue to be used in that way, by teachers, by educators, by young people coming together and deciding to educate themselves, by people of faith and conscience, and by people in reentry centers and in prisons as well.
What would you say, if anything, to everyone here today?
I would say, please be serious about building a movement. Not just having a conversation, but building a movement that will shift public consciousness about those young people as well as older people that we have locked up and locked out, viewed as disposable. Movement rooted in genuine care, compassion, and concern for each and every one of us. Movement rooted in the understanding that each of us is entitled to basic dignity and humanity, no matter who we are or what we may have done. It is not enough to simply talk. We've also got to be willing to get to work. And that means opening our minds and opening our hearts to people returning home from prison, providing support to families who have loved ones behind bars, and actually being willing to work for justice, being willing to advocate for the repeal of harsh mandatory minimum sentences and 3 strikes laws, and being willing to dismantle zero tolerance policies in schools, and being willing to oppose discrimination against people released from prison in employment and housing and access to education and public benefits. We've actually got to be willing to get to work, and I hope that this conference is a reflection of the collective willingness of many in the community to actually begin that work.
So I've heard from many different school officials that zero tolerance policies, that's the only way. So what would you propose as maybe an alternative to that?
I think what you see in middle class, upper middle class school districts is typically a different approach. Mm-hmm. It's an approach designed to support young people. It's an approach that's organized around intervention. How do we intervene in this child's life to ensure that he gets the help and support that he needs, and without ignoring the real needs of the other children in the classroom who deserve a quality education as well. And so when a kid is struggling, dealing dope or having, experimenting with drugs, or maybe even having a problem with addiction or abuse, the first response isn't to throw the kid out of school. The first response is, well, how do we get this kid treatment? How do we get this kid help? And unfortunately, I think in poor schools, the assumption is, well, of course these kids are doing this. Forgetting, of course, that they're doing the same kinds of things in wealthier schools, that kids in wealthier schools shoplift, they steal, they experiment with drugs and sell them. Kids make mistakes and, struggle and find their way. And, we have such a different approach, I think, when it's for kids, particularly young black males. Our first instinct is punitiveness rather than compassion. And I think, school discipline should start from a premise that every child deserves support, care and concern, and the kinds of interventions that will ensure they succeed as well as their classmates, rather than interventions that are designed to simply punish and discard.
Okay, so what would you say? I know in your book you talk a lot about different companies that help perpetuate this model of the mass incarceration of people. And I know specifically you spoke of the Parchman prison in your book. So what would you say, what efforts are being done to maybe reconstruct their model so that they're no longer engaging in this type of slave labor, so that the prisoners aren't working that type of way?
Well, it's interesting because I think prison labor is a little bit of a tricky issue, and here's why. On the one hand, I think a lot of prisoners will tell you that they want to work in prison rather than just sitting in a literal cage like a zoo animal, staring at a blank wall. They would like to be able to learn skills. They would like to be able to do something productive. Hopefully, learn skills that they could use when they're released.
Yeah.
The problem is that we exploit this labor. And, there are companies that have discovered that rather than shipping jobs overseas and exploiting labor on other continents and other countries, they can exploit labor at home by hiring people behind bars, but paying them far less than a minimum wage, in some cases just pennies on the dollar. And that is what makes prison labor in the United States unconscionable. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits slavery, but provides an exception for forced labor in prison. And so, when people say, oh, we outlawed slavery in the United States, not quite.
Yeah.
Not quite. The Constitution actually allows for it for people in prison. And so I would hope that we abandon prisons as we know them entirely as sites of cruelty and dehumanization, and instead, when people must be removed from our society for a period of time, that we do provide them opportunities to work and to learn skills, but we ensure that they are paid a fair wage, and that their labor isn't exploited and they're not simply used as a means to some other profit-making end.
So what efforts could consumers take to ensure that they're not buying products that came from this exploited labor?
Well, there's a great book called Who Makes Money from Mass Incarceration. It's called Prison Profiteers. The subtitle is Who Makes Money off of Mass Incarceration. And you can find in there lists names of companies that are profiting from mass incarceration, private prison companies, as well as many other corporations and private interests that are making a killing, even in an economic recession, off mass incarceration. And I think it would be phenomenal if people began organizing boycotts of companies that exploit prison labor, publicizing which companies those are, and also divesting from urging organizations to divest from private prisons. The United Methodist Church recently announced that it was divesting from private prisons. All of its pension plans and monies that they have invested. Many mutual funds have private prisons as part of their portfolio because they've become so profitable. And so many churches, universities, don't even fully realize that they are invested in private prisons because the mutual funds that they're invested in include private prisons.
So when you speak of divesting in private prisons, what would you say the privatization of prisons has done to the numbers of people in prison? Like, has that gave them a drive to incarcerate more people. Therefore, because there's a money means to it, so if I want to make more money, I need more people in here.
Yes.
So is there a push behind that in order to incarcerate more people?
Yes, yes, absolutely. In fact, one of America's largest private prison companies sent a letter to all of the governors in the United States urging them to convert their prisons to private prisons and kind of offering to give them a special deal if they would privatize their prisons. But they offered one condition, and that was that the governors of these states and the legislatures had to promise that they would remain over 90% full.
Wow.
And so, the profit motive certainly creates perverse incentives. And you see private prison companies lobbying for harsh mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws. Private prison companies have lobbied for harsh laws aimed at immigrants.
Wow.
In the hopes that women and children will need places to be detained before deportation. And so the profit motive absolutely corrupts the political process, and it no longer becomes about making communities safe and secure, but instead, legislators are more than tempted to please private prison companies that will often help bankroll their campaigns and donate and all of that. So it is a corrupting influence. But I think it's important to keep in mind that this system of mass incarceration wasn't born of a profit motive. It's one of the reasons that it will be especially challenging to dismantle the system now that a profit motive exists. But our system of mass incarceration was born of a deliberate attempt by our politicians to exploit our nation's racial divisions and anxieties for political gain. That's where this system came from. Politicians using get tough rhetoric, knowing full well that much of that get tough rhetoric would, really appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who are anxious about and resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. And that get tough rhetoric and mentality, getting tough on crime, getting tough on welfare recipients, all of that was really part of a backlash against the civil rights movement. And unfortunately, it's rhetoric that politicians from both political parties found themselves embracing. And unfortunately, many Black leaders and politicians who were desperate in many cases to deal with the problem of crime were found themselves echoing, and resistance to the emergence of this new prison state kind of collapsed across the political spectrum. But this system wasn't born of a profit motive. It was born by our willingness to throw away some people. But now that private prison companies and other corporations have found that they can make a killing caging human beings, the profit motive makes it all the more difficult for us to confront and challenge what has been done.